A Woman's Confession by Guy de Maupassant. My friend, you asked me to tell you what is the most vivid memory I have of my life. Well, since I am now extremely old and have neither children nor any remaining relatives, I feel I can quite freely confess something to you. All I ask is that you never reveal my name. I was often in love, and over the years had many admirers. Now that there is no trace of it left, I can tell you that I was once considered quite a beauty. And it was love that put life into me. It became the air I breathed. I would have sooner died than not be in the heart and mind of someone else every minute of the day. Although some women claim there is never more than one serious love in life, for me it was different. I have often loved someone with such intensity that I thought it would be the last till the end of time. But these affairs too petered out quite naturally, like a fire with no fuel to sustain it. I shall tell you about the very first of my adventures. I was very much the innocent party in this, and it had a strong influence on all my other affairs. It was that dreadful story in the papers about the revenge taken on that chemist, which reminded me of an appalling business I was once reluctantly involved in myself. I had been married for a year to a very rich man, the Count Harvey, a Breton aristocrat with whom I was of course not in love. True love in my view can only flourish in conditions where there is a mixture of freedom and constraint. An imposed love, sanctioned by law and blessed by a priest, does not really seem the same thing at all. One stolen kiss is worth 1,000 of the other kind, don't you think? My husband was tall, elegant, every inch a gentleman, but a bit short on intelligence. He used to bark out the most ill-considered opinions, and it was clear that his mind was full of received ideas handed down to him from his mother and father, who in turn had inherited them from theirs. He never mulled a thing over, but came up with an immediate and naturally inadequate response. He was not in the least aware of this limitation, or that there might be more than one way of looking at things. His was a closed mind in which nothing much was really going on. There was no ventilation of ideas, no renewal of the spirit. It was like a house, all the doors and windows of which are firmly shut. The manor house in which we ourselves lived was in the back of beyond. It was a great gloomy place surrounded by enormous trees whose trunks were covered with moss and looked like bearded old men. The parkland in which it was set was heavily wooded, and itself surrounded by a deep trench or ha-ha. At the furthest boundary of the property, giving on to moorland, were two small lakes full of reeds and water plants. Between them, at the edge of a small stream, my husband had constructed a small shelter or blind for duck shooting. In addition to the usual servants, we had a watchman, a brute of a fellow totally devoted to my husband, for whom he would have happily laid down his life, and for myself, a personal maid who by this time had become almost a friend, and who was equally attached to me. She was a foundling I had brought back from Spain 5 years previously. With her deep olive skin and her dark eyes, she could easily have been taken for a gypsy. She had thick, black hair, always a little dishevelled around the forehead, and looked about 20 years of age, though in fact she was only 16. It was the beginning of autumn, and a great deal of hunting was underway either on our property or that of our neighbours in the area. A young man, the baron of such and such a place, began calling at the manor rather more often than was normal, until his visits quite abruptly stopped. I thought no more about it, but noticed that my husband's attitude towards me was much changed. He seemed preoccupied, spoke little, and never kissed me. Despite the fact that we had separate rooms so that I could have a little privacy, often at night I would hear furtive footsteps come as far as my door, and after a few minutes retreat. Since my window was on the ground floor, I often used to fancy that I also heard someone wandering around outside the manor itself. I said as much to my husband, who stared fixedly at me for a few seconds before saying, "Nothing to worry about. It must be the night watchman." One night, as we were finishing dinner, at which Harvey had been in unusually and therefore suspiciously good spirits, he asked me, "How would you like to spend a couple of hours with me down at the duck blind? There's a fox who started helping himself to my chickens every night. I want to get him." I was surprised and hesitated a little before replying. "Certainly, my dear, if that's what you would like." I should add that I myself was a keen huntswoman and would go after both wolf and boar with the best of them, so it was not unnatural for him to suggest what he did. But suddenly he started to look very nervous. It was most peculiar. All evening long he was restless. No sooner had he sat down than he got up again, and so it went on. He was obviously in a state of very great agitation. Then at about 10 o'clock he asked if I was ready, and I rose. He brought me my gun himself, and I asked if we were using bullets or shot. At this he looked surprised and said, "Oh, shot will do the trick. You can be sure of that." Then after a few seconds he turned round and said, again in a very peculiar sort of tone, "Well, I have to hand it to you. You're a very cool customer indeed." I started to laugh. "Why on earth do you say that? It doesn't take much to go and pick off an old fox. What on earth's got into you, my dear?" We then set off across the grounds in silence. The full moon cast a yellow sheen on the dark old building and its gleaming slate roof. A patch of light could be seen at the summits of the 2 towers flanking the house. No sound disturbed the melancholy silence of the clear night air, and the heavy subdued atmosphere in which we walked seemed lifeless. Not a breath of air moved, not a frog croaked, and in the deep gloom which weighed upon the world not even the hoot of an owl could be heard. When we reached the parkland trees, however, the smell of fallen leaves brought a freshness to the air. My husband remained silent. He was obviously listening and watching for something. With his huntsman's instinct now fully aroused, he seemed almost to be sniffing the shadows for a scent. Soon we reached the edge of the lakes. Here again not a breath of air ruffled the tresses of reeds, but barely perceptible movements could be seen in the water itself. A point would appear on the surface, and from it would spread, like luminous furrows on a brow, a series of gently widening ripples. When we reached the blind where we were to lie in ambush, my husband ushered me in first, then slowly loaded his gun. The click of the flintlock produced a strange effect on me. Sensing my alarm, my husband said, "Perhaps you have seen enough by now. If so, do feel free to leave." His words surprised me, and I said, "Certainly not. Why should I leave now, for goodness sake?" "You are in a strange mood tonight." "Just as you wish," he murmured. We remained there motionless until, after half an hour or so, and still nothing had come to disturb the deep tranquility of the clear night, I whispered, "Are you absolutely certain this is the way he comes?" Harvey started as if I had suddenly bitten him. "Absolutely sure. Get that straight," he hissed, close to my ear. Once again silence fell. I was just beginning to nod off when my husband gripped my arm. In a changed voice he whispered urgently again, "There! Can you see him? Over by the trees!" I looked but could make out nothing. Slowly and without taking his eyes off me, he put his gun to his shoulder. I too was about to fire when suddenly, no more than 30 paces away, a man came out into the moonlight. He was moving quickly, his body hunched, as if running away from something. I was so stupefied that I cried out loudly. Before I could turn round, I saw a flash and heard a deafening report. I watched as the man rolled on the ground like a wolf struck by a bullet. I started to scream with fright, when suddenly Harvey grabbed me furiously round the throat with his hand. I was thrown to the ground, then picked up bodily and carried aloft by him towards the figure stretched out on the ground. He threw me hard on top of it, as if he wanted to crack open my skull. I thought my last moment had come. He was about to kill me. Already his heel was poised over my forehead. Suddenly, before I could see what was happening, it was his turn to be grabbed and thrown to the ground. I got up quickly and saw Pepita, my maid, kneeling on top of him. She was clinging to him like a furious wildcat, frenziedly tearing out his hair and clawing the skin of his face. Then, as if suddenly overwhelmed by another instinct, she got up and threw herself now on the other man's dead body. She clasped it to her bosom, kissed the eyes and the mouth, searching desperately for some breath of life beyond her lover's precious lips. My husband, now on his feet again, stood and watched. As understanding dawned upon him, he flung himself at my feet. "My darling, forgive me. I thought you were being unfaithful to me. It's this poor girl's lover I have killed. My watchman." But I was watching the terrible sights of the living girl, her distracted kisses raining on the dead man, and her pitiful starts of despair as she sobbed. It was then that I decided to give my husband real grounds for suspicion.
Who is to pay? Sweater reached the hall almost at the same moment that Rushton entered by the front door. They greeted each other in a friendly way, and after a few remarks concerning the work that was being done, they went into the drawing room where Owen and Easton were, and Rushton said, "What about this room? Have you made up your mind what you're going to have done with it?" "Yes," replied Sweater, "but I'll tell you about that afterwards. What I'm anxious about is all the drains. Have you bought the plans?" "Yes." "What's it going to cost?" "Just wait a minute," said Rushton, with a slight gesture calling Sweater's attention to the presence of the two workmen. Sweater understood. "You might leave that for a few minutes, will you?" Rushton continued, addressing Owen and Easton. "Go and get on with something else for a little while." When they were alone, Rushton closed the door and remarked, "It's always as well not to let these fellows know more than is necessary." Sweater agreed. "Now this here drain right really is two separate jobs," said Rushton. "First, the drains of the house, that is, the part of the work that's actually on your ground. When that's done, there'll have to be a pipe carried right along under this private road to the main road to connect the drain to the house with the town main. You follow me?" "Perfectly. What's this going to cost for the lot?" "For the drains to the house, 25, and for the connecting pipe, 30. 55 for the lot." That's the lowest you can go for it, eh?" "That's the lowest. I've figured it out most carefully. The time and the materials, and that's practically all I'm charging you." The truth of the matter was that Rushton had nothing whatsoever to do with estimating the cost of this work. He had not the necessary knowledge to do so. Hunter had drawn the plans, calculated the cost, and prepared the estimate. "I've been thinking over this business lately," said Sweater, looking at Rushton with a cunning leer. "I don't see why I should have to pay for the connecting pipe. The corporation ought to pay for that. What do you say?" Rushton laughed. "I don't see why not. I think we could arrange it all right, don't you?" Sweater went on. "Anyhow, the work will have to be done, so you better let them get on with it. £55 covers both jobs, you say?" "Yes." "Oh, all right. You get on with it, and I'll see what can be done with the corporation later on." "I don't suppose we'll find them any difficult to deal with," said Rushton with a grin, and Sweater smiled in agreement. As they were passing through the hall, they met Hunter, who'd just arrived. He was rather surprised to see them, as he knew nothing of their appointment. He wished them good morning, in an awkward, hesitating undertone, as if they were doubtful how his greeting would be received. Sweater nodded slightly, but Rushton ignored him altogether, and Nimrod passed on, looking and feeling like a disreputable cur that had just been kicked. As Sweater and Rushton walked about the house, Hunter hovered about them at a respectful distance, hoping that presently some notice might be taken of him. His dismal countenance became even longer than usual when he observed that they were about to leave the house without appearing to even know that he was there. However, just as they were going out, Rushton paused on the threshold and called him, "Mr. Hunter." "Yes, sir." Nimrod ran to him like a dog taken notice of by his master. If he had possessed a tail, it's probable that he would have wagged it. Rushton gave him the plans with an intimation that the work was to be proceeded with. For some time after they'd gone, Hunter crawled silently about the house, in and out of rooms, up and down corridors and staircases. After a while he went to the room where Newman was, and stood quietly watching him for about 10 minutes as he worked. The man was painting the skirting, and just then he came to a part that was split in several places, so he took his knife and began to fill the cracks with putty. He was so nervous under Hunter's scrutiny that his hand trembled to such an extent that it took him almost twice as long as it should have done, and Hunter told him so with brutal directness. "Never mind about puttying up with silly cracks as them," he shouted. "Fill them up with paint. We can't afford to pay you messing about like that." Newman made no reply. Misery found no excuse for bullying anyone else, because they were all tearing into it for all they were worth. As he wandered up and down the house like an evil spirit, he was followed by the furtively unfriendly glances of these men, who cursed him in their hearts as he passed. He snuck into the drawing room, and after standing with a malignant expression, silently watching Owen and Easton, he came out again without having uttered a word. Although he frequently acted in this manner, yet somehow today the circumstances worried Owen considerably. He wondered uneasily what it meant, and began to feel vaguely apprehensive. Hunter's silence seemed more menacing than his speech.
Out of Season by Ernest Hemingway. On the 4 lira he had earned by spading the hotel garden, he got quite drunk. He saw the young gentleman coming down the path and spoke to him mysteriously. The young gentleman said he had not eaten yet, but would be ready to go as soon as lunch was finished, 40 minutes or an hour. At the cantina near the bridge, they trusted him for 3 more grappers because he was so confident and mysterious about his job for the afternoon. It was a windy day with the sun coming out from behind the clouds and then going under in sprinkles of rain. A wonderful day for trout fishing. The young gentleman came out of the hotel and asked him about the rods. Should his wife come behind with the rods? Yes, said Peduzzi. Let her follow us. The young gentleman went back into the hotel and spoke to his wife. He and Peduzzi started down the road. The young gentleman had a musette over his shoulder. Peduzzi saw the wife, who looked as young as the young gentleman and was wearing mountain boots and a blue beret, start out to follow them down the road, carrying the fishing rods unjointed, one in each hand. Peduzzi didn't like her to be way back there. Signorina, he called, winking at the young gentleman. Come up here and walk with us. Signorina, come up here. Let us walk together. Peduzzi wanted all 3 to walk down to the street of Cortina together. The wife stayed behind, following rather sullenly. Signorina, Peduzzi called, come up here with us. The young gentleman looked back and shouted something. The wife stopped lagging behind and walked up. Everyone they met walking through the main street of the town of Peduzzi greeted elaborately. Buon dia toro, tipping his hat. The bank clerk stared at him from the door of the fascist cafe. Groups of 3 and 4 people standing in front of the shop stared at the 3. The workmen in their stone-powered jackets working on the foundations of the new hotel looked up as they passed. Nobody spoke or gave any sign to them except the town beggar, lean and old with a spittle-thickened beard, who lifted his hat as they passed. Peduzzi stopped in front of the store with the window full of bottles and brought his empty grappa bottle from an inside pocket of his old military coat. A little to drink, some marsala for the signorina, something to drink. He gestured with the bottle. It was a wonderful day. Marsala? You like marsala, signorina? A little marsala? The wife stood sullenly. You'll have to play up to this, she said. I can't understand a word he says. He's drunk, isn't he? The young gentleman appeared not to hear Peduzzi. He was thinking, what in hell makes him say marsala? That's what Max Beerbohm drinks. Geld, Peduzzi said finally, taking hold of the young gentleman's sleeve. Lira. He smiled, reluctant to press the subject, but needing to bring the young gentleman into action. The young gentleman took out his pocketbook and gave him a 10 lira note. Peduzzi went up the steps to the door of the speciality of domestic and foreign wine shop. It was locked. It is closed until 2, someone passing in the street said scornfully. Peduzzi came down the steps. He felt hurt. Never mind, he said. We can get it at the Concordia. The door of the Concordia shut on the young gentleman and the wife. 3 masalas, said the young gentleman to the girl behind the pastry counter. 2, you mean? She asked. No, he said. 1 for a vecchio. Oh, she said, a vecchio, and laughed, getting down the bottle. She poured out the 3 muddy-looking drinks into 3 glasses. The wife was sitting at a table under the line of newspapers on sticks. The young gentleman put one of the masalas in front of her. You might as well drink it, he said. Maybe it'll make you feel better. She sat and looked at the glass. The young gentleman went outside the door with a glass for Peduzzi, but could not see him. I don't know where he is, he said, coming back into the pastry room carrying the glass. He wanted a quart of it, said the wife. How much is a quarter litre? The young gentleman asked the girl. Of the Bianco? 1 lira. No, of the masala. Put these 2 in too, he said, giving her his own glass and the 1 poured for Peduzzi. She filled the quarter-litre wine measure with a funnel. A bottle to carry it, said the young gentleman. She went to hunt for a bottle. It all amused her. I'm sorry you feel so rotten tiny, he said. I'm sorry I talked the way I did at lunch. We were both getting at the same thing from different angles. It doesn't make any difference, she said. None of it makes any difference. Are you too cold? He asked. I wish you'd worn another sweater. I've got on 3 sweaters. The girl came in with a very slim brown bottle and poured the masala into it. The young gentleman paid 5 lira more. They went out of the door. The girl was amused. Peduzzi was walking up and down at the other end, out of the wind and holding the rods. Come on, he said. I will carry the rods. What difference does it make if anybody sees them? No one will trouble us. No one will make any trouble for me and Cortina. I know them at the Monogibio. I have been a soldier. Everybody in this town likes me. I sell frogs. What if it is forbidden to fish? Not a thing. Nothing. No trouble. Big trout, I tell you. Lots of them. They were walking down the hill toward the river. The town was in the back of them. The sun had gone under and it was sprinkling rain. There, said Peduzzi, pointing to a girl in the doorway of a house they passed. My daughter. His doctor, the wife said. Has he got to show us his doctor? He said his daughter, said the young gentleman. The girl went into the house as Peduzzi pointed. They walked down the hill across the fields and then turned to follow the riverbank. Peduzzi talked rapidly, with much winking and knowingness. As they walked 3 abreast, the wife caught his breath across the wind. Once he nudged her in the ribs. Part of the time, he talked in Diampezzo dialect, and sometimes in Tyroler German dialect. He could not make out which the young gentleman and his wife understood the best, so he was being bilingual. But as the young gentleman said, Jar Jar Peduzzi decided to talk all together in Tyroler. The young gentleman and the wife understood nothing. Everybody in the town saw us going through with these rods. We're probably being followed by the game police now. I wish we weren't in on this damn thing. This damned old fool is so drunk too. Of course you haven't got the guts to just go back, said the wife. Of course you have to go on. Why don't you go back? Go on back, Tiny. I'm going to stay with you. If you go to jail, you might as well both go. They turned sharp down the bank and Peduzzi stood, his coat blowing in the wind, gesturing at the river. It was brown and muddy. Off on the right there was a dump heap. He says it's at least half an hour more. Go on back, Tiny. You're cold in this wind anyway. It's a rotten day and we aren't going to have any fun anyway. All right, she said, and climbed up the glassy bank. Fiduci was down at the river and did not notice her till she was almost out of sight over the crest. "Frau," he shouted. "Frau, Fraulein, you're not going?" She went on over the crest of the hill. "She's gone," said Fiduci. It shocked him. He took off the rubber bands that held the rod segments together and commenced to joint up one of the rods. "But you said it was half an hour further." "Oh yes, it is good half an hour down. It is good here too." "Really?" "Of course. It is good here and good there too." The young gentleman sat down on the bank and jointed up a rod, put on the reel, and threaded the line through the guides. He felt uncomfortable and afraid that any minute a gamekeeper or a posse of citizens would come over the bank from the town. He could see the houses of the town and the campanile over the edge of the hill. He opened his leader box. Fiduci leaned over and dug his flat hard thumb and forefinger in and tangled the moistened leaders. "Have you some lead?" "No." "You must have some lead." Fiduci was excited. "You must have piombo. Piombo. A little piombo. Just here. Just above the hook, or your bait will float on the water. You must have it. Just a little piombo. Have you got some?" "No." He looked through all his pockets desperately, sifting through the cloth dirt in the linings of his inside military pockets. "I haven't any." "We must have piombo." "We can't fish then," said the young gentleman and unjointed the rod, reeling the line back through the guides. "We'll get some piombo and fish tomorrow." "But listen, Cara, you must have piombo. The line will lie flat on the water." Fiduci's day was going to pieces just before his eyes. "You must have piombo. A little is enough. Your stuff is all clean and new, but you have no lead. I would have bought some. You said you had everything." The young gentleman looked at the stream discolored by the melting snow. "I know," he said. "We'll get some piombo and fish tomorrow." "At what hour in the morning? Tell me that." "At 7. The sun came out. It was warm and pleasant. The young gentleman felt relieved. He was no longer breaking the law. Sitting on the bank, he took the bottle of masala out of his pocket and passed it to Fiduci. Fiduci passed it back. The young gentleman took a drink of it and passed it to Fiduci again. Fiduci passed it back again. "Drink," he said. "Drink. It's your masala." After another short drink, the young gentleman handed the bottle back. Fiduci had been watching it closely. He took the bottle very hurriedly and tipped it up. The grey hairs in the folds of his neck oscillated as he drank, his eyes fixed on the end of the narrow brown bottle. He drank it all. The sun shone while he drank. It was wonderful. This was a great day after all. A wonderful day. Sente Caro. In the morning at 7. He had called the young gentleman Caro several times, and nothing had happened. It was good masala. His eyes glistened. Days like this stretched out ahead. It would begin again at 7 in the morning. They started to walk up the hill toward the town. The young gentleman went on ahead. He was quite a way up the hill. Fiduci called to him. "Listen, Caro, can you let me take 5 lira for a favour?" "For today?" asking the young gentleman, frowning. "No, not today. Give it to me today for tomorrow. I will provide everything for tomorrow. Pain, salami, formaggio, good stuff for all of us. You and I had the signora. Bait for fishing, minnows, not worms only. Perhaps I can get some masala, all for 5 lira. 5 lira for a favour." The young gentleman looked through his pocketbook and took out a 2 lira note and 2 ones. "Thank you, Carlo." "Thank you," said Peduzzi in the tone of one member of the Carlton Club accepting the Morning Post from another. This was living. He was through with the hotel garden, breaking up frozen manure with a dung fork. Life was opening out. "Until 7 o'clock then, Carlo," he said, slapping the young gentleman on the back. "Promptly at 7. "I may not be going," said the young gentleman, putting his purse back in his pocket. "What?" said Peduzzi. "I will have minnows, signor. Salami, everything. You and I and the signora, the 3 of us." "I may not be going," said the young gentleman. "Very probably not. I will leave word with the padrone at the hotel office."
Hop Frog by Edgar Allan Poe. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rare bird. About the refinements, or, as he called them, the ghosts of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over-niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days are rather longer at courts than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that, in Hop Frog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the 7 ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjection of gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and of course consolation to the king, for, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could only move with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, The prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises he certainly much more resembled a squirrel, or a small monkey, than a frog. I am not able to say, with precision, from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop Frog, and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvellous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it whenever she could, for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hop Frog and Trippetta were sure to be called in play. Hop Frog in especial was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up, under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in fever of expectation. As for costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume, a week or even a month in advance. And in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated, I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. Most probably they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and, as a last resource, they sent for Trippetta and Hop Frog. When the two little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council. But the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hop Frog," said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hop Frog sighed. "And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man. Something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits." Hop Frog endeavoured as usual to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king. But the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant. Roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do! Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow, his large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table, and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, Hop Frog, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us. And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the 7. Hopfrog also laughed, though feebly and somewhat vacantly. Come, come, said the king, impatiently. Have you nothing to suggest? I am endeavouring to think of something novel, replied the dwarf, abstractly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. Endeavouring? Cried the tyrant fiercely. What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive you are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this. And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. Drink, I say, shouted the monster. Or by the fiends... The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best as she could, and not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. What? What are you making that noise for? Demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, Aye, aye. How could it have been me? The sound appeared to come from without, observed one of the courtiers. I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires. True, replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. But on the honour of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth. Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade. I cannot tell what was the association of idea, observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life. But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons and... Here we are! Cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. 8 to a fraction! I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is this diversion? We call it, replied the cripple, the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted. We will enact it, remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. The beauty of the game, continued Hopfrog, lies in the fright it occasions among the women. Capital, roared in chorus the monarchs and his ministry. I will equip you as orangutans, proceeded the dwarf. Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished. Oh, this is exquisite, exclaimed the king. Hopfrog, I will make a man of you. The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped, en masse, from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable. It must be, said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8, by ocular demonstration, that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual, but, in order not to look unsightly, this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars it seems she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who on account of the crowded state of the saloon could not all be expected to keep from out its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the way, and a flambeau, emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatids that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in, all together, for the impediment of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. When the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, The king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its centre, and of course in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed closely at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically in its right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-conceived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screams Hopfrog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me! I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatids, he returned, as he went, to the center of the room, leaped with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hopfrog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down towards them, as though endeavouring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished were the whole company at this ascent, that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his councillors, when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth, and glared, with an expression of maniacal rage, into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held a flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely, amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher and higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and as he made this movement, the crowd again sank, for a brief instant, into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity, and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenceless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.